What happens when the man you've been mocking turns out to be your boss? This team discovered that the hard way. It all went down on one of those mornings that gave no hints of the chaos waiting ahead. The sun shone brightly over downtown Dallas, and the streets buzzed with the usual energy as people rushed through their day. Among them was a man named Elijah, a delivery driver who had seen it all. Elijah wasn't flashy or loud, but there was a quiet dignity about him that spoke volumes. That morning, he had an important delivery to make, one that took him to one of the city's most upscale restaurants, Bel Andrea's fine dining, known for its high-end clientele and snobby reputation. It wasn't the type of place Elijah typically spent time in, but duty called. His truck rumbled into the back alley, where deliveries were usually dropped off. Even the loading area had an air of exclusivity. Large silver doors marked "Staff Only" loomed tall, almost daring anyone who didn't belong to step through. Elijah grabbed the invoice clipboard, slipped on his gloves, and carefully stacked boxes of organic produce and specialty seafood onto his dolly. As he wheeled the load toward the entrance, faint laughter floated out from inside. The kind of laughter that made your chest tighten, filled with ridicule and superiority. Elijah shook his head lightly. He was no stranger to being underestimated or judged, but he wasn't about to let it bother him. He knocked twice on the steel door and waited. When it opened, a young man in a crisp white chef's jacket stared at him like he was some kind of inconvenience. Behind him, two other staff members peeked out, one trying to stifle a chuckle, the other rolling her eyes. "Deliveries are supposed to come earlier," the young man snapped, his tone dripping with annoyance. Elijah calmly held up the invoice. "I'm right on schedule, sir. Fresh seafood from Gulf Coast imports, and the organic greens you requested." The chef waved him off. "Whatever. Just bring it in, and don't block the kitchen entrance." As Elijah pushed his dolly inside, he noticed more staff members glancing at him, their expressions a mix of amusement and condescension. Someone muttered under their breath, "Guess the company sends just anyone to places like this." It wasn't just the words, it was the tone that was mocking and dismissive. Elijah kept moving, unloading the boxes carefully. His hands remained steady, even though their words lingered in the air like a bad smell. But Elijah didn't flinch. Not yet. He knew something they didn't, and it was only a matter of time before everything changed. As Elijah maneuvered the dolly deeper into the restaurant, he couldn't help but take in his surroundings. Bel Andrea's was as extravagant as the rumors claimed. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a golden glow over marble floors so polished you could see a reflection. The open kitchen gleamed with stainless steel appliances, and every corner of the place screamed wealth. But beneath the surface, something felt off. Elijah noticed the way the staff moved, quick and efficient. Yes, but with an air of self-importance that didn't sit right. These weren't people proud of their work, they were proud of their hierarchy. And right now, Elijah was at the bottom of it. "Make sure you're not blocking the chef's station," barked a woman in a sharp black suit. She didn't even look up from her clipboard as she walked by. "Yes, ma'am," Elijah replied, his tone polite but firm. He didn't mind following instructions, but he could feel her gaze linger, scrutinizing him as if she was looking for a reason to dismiss him. Nearby, two waiters stood at the edge of the dining area, folding napkins and whispering. It didn't take a detective to figure out they were talking about him. Every now and then, they glanced his way, barely hiding their smirks. "What do you think? 5 minutes before he messes something up?" one of them said, snickering. Elijah ignored them and kept working. Years in this business had taught him that people like this weren't worth his energy. He focused on unloading the boxes neatly onto the counter by the walk-in fridge, but the comments kept coming. "You'd think someone delivering to a place like this would at least dress better," another voice chimed in. Elijah glanced at his uniform. It was clean, pressed, and practical for someone hauling boxes all day. But to these people, it wasn't good enough. It didn't matter. He wasn't here to impress anyone. As he finished the first load and turned to head back to the truck, he passed by a group of line cooks near the grill. They paused their chatter and took a long look at him. One of them, a tall man with a smirk that practically screamed trouble, leaned over and whispered loudly enough for Elijah to hear. that he couldn't even afford to eat here, let alone step through the front door. The others laughed, and Elijah felt his jaw tighten. He had plenty of practice letting things slide, but this was starting to push the limits. Still, he kept his composure and made his way back outside for the next load. But the worst was yet to come. Inside, the mocking laughter grew louder, and Elijah could feel their eyes on him like he was some sort of spectacle. Elijah returned to his truck, loading the second set of boxes onto his dolly. The morning heat was creeping in, and the sweat on his brow mixed with the dust from the alley. But as he pushed the dolly back toward the kitchen doors, the laughter echoed from inside. They hadn't even tried to lower their voices. When he re-entered the kitchen, the head chef, a sharp-featured man named Damien, stood by the counter inspecting the ingredients Elijah had already delivered. He turned his nose up slightly as he picked up a crate of seafood. "Is this the best they could send?" Damien muttered, just loud enough for Elijah to hear. Elijah paused for a moment. "If there's an issue with the quality, I can call the supplier." Damien cut him off with a dismissive wave. No, just drop it off and leave. We've got more important things to focus on." As Elijah unloaded the second batch of boxes, he noticed how Damien carried himself. The chef spoke loudly, directing his staff with exaggerated authority, as if he needed everyone in the room to know he was in charge. "I swear," Damien said, turning to one of the servers, "the standards are dropping everywhere. Look at this guy. Do they not teach professionalism to delivery drivers anymore?" The server, a young woman with a forced smile, glanced at Elijah but said nothing. Instead, she nodded at Damien and busied herself setting up the nearby dining area. Elijah kept his head down, finishing unloading. He wasn't about to let their words get to him, but he couldn't ignore the growing irritation. It wasn't just the comments, it was the blatant lack of respect, the assumption that he was less than simply because of his job. As he moved to stack the empty crates, one of the kitchen staff called out, "Hey, delivery guy, you missed a box." Elijah was confused because he was certain he hadn't missed anything. The staff member pointed to a crate sitting near the door. Working as he did, Elijah walked over, bent down to pick it up, and realized it was empty. Another round of laughter rippled through the kitchen. "Just messing with you, man," the guy said, slapping his knee. "Relax a little." Elijah didn't respond. He just placed the empty crate back down and finished his work without another word. Inside, his patience was wearing thin, but he reminded himself of why he was there. He had a job to do and a point to make, even if they didn't know it yet. When the delivery was finally complete, Elijah handed the signed invoice to Damien. The chef didn't even look at him as he scrolled his signature across the paper. "You can go now," Damien said curtly, not bothering with a thank you. Elijah paused for a moment, his eyes steady. "Have a good day," he said evenly before turning and heading back to his truck. But just as he reached the door, one of the waiters muttered under his breath, "Yeah, go back to wherever you came from." That was it. Elijah stopped in his tracks, his hand resting on the door handle for a brief moment. The room fell silent. All eyes were on him. Elijah turned slowly, his gaze meeting the waiter's. There was no anger in his expression, just a calm confidence that immediately silenced the smirks and whispers. "I came here," Elijah said, his voice steady, "to deliver something you clearly need more of: respect." The room stayed quiet as Elijah walked out, but the real surprise was still waiting. It was only a matter of time before they realized who he really was. Elijah leaned against the side of his truck, taking a moment to catch his breath. The delivery was done, but the weight of the morning lingered. He'd been in similar situations countless times, but something about today felt different. Maybe it was the way they all seemed so comfortable in their assumptions, so blind to the possibility that he was more than what they saw. He glanced at the restaurant's grand facade, the name Bel Andrea's etched in elegant gold letters above the entrance. It was surreal. Just a few weeks ago, he had signed the final papers that made him the owner of this place, a bold step in his growing empire of fine dining establishments. But Elijah's journey to this moment hadn't been built on privilege or shortcuts. It had been built on years of sweat, sacrifice, and a relentless drive to prove himself. He grew up in a small town in Louisiana, where opportunities were scarce and expectations for someone like him even scarcer. His parents worked tirelessly, instilling in him the value of hard work and integrity. Elijah had started as a dishwasher at a local diner when he was just 16. Back then, he'd watch the cooks and servers with fascination, dreaming of the day he could create something bigger, something extraordinary. Over the years, he climbed the ladder, moving from kitchen staff to manager, and eventually saved enough to open his first restaurant. It wasn't flashy, but it was his. And from there, his vision only grew. When the opportunity to buy Bel Andrea's came up, Elijah didn't hesitate. He knew it was a risk, but he also knew what this place could become under his leadership. The restaurant had a reputation for exclusivity, but Elijah saw potential beyond the surface. He wanted to turn it into something more, an establishment where everyone felt valued, from the guests to the staff to the people making deliveries. But the transition wasn't going to be easy. Elijah had chosen not to announce his ownership immediately, opting instead to observe the culture firsthand. He wanted to see how the staff operated when they thought no one was watching. What he saw that morning confirmed what he suspected. Change was long overdue. Elijah climbed back into his truck and made a few notes on his tablet, preparing for the meeting with the staff later that afternoon. He had kept the announcement of his arrival vague, telling the manager to gather everyone in the dining room at 3 p.m. He thought about Damien and how quickly he'd judged and dismissed Elijah. He thought about the waiters, the kitchen staff, and the manager who barely acknowledged him. Elijah didn't feel anger toward them. He felt disappointment in how easily people fell into patterns of prejudice and disrespect. By the time he drove away from the restaurant, Elijah had made up his mind. The meeting wouldn't just be about an introduction. It would be about setting the tone for what Bel Andrea's would stand for moving forward: respect, humility, and equality. These weren't just buzzwords to him. They were the foundation of everything he believed in. And in a few short hours, they would find out exactly who Elijah was and why he was there. The clock struck 3 p.m., and the staff began to gather in the main dining room of Bel Andrea's fine dining. Some looked curious, others annoyed. Damien leaned against a table, arms crossed, his expression a mixture of irritation and boredom. "What's this about?" he muttered to one of the servers. "We're slammed tonight, and now we have to sit through a meeting?" The restaurant manager, a middle-aged man named Greg, stood near the entrance, looking unusually nervous. He'd been told to assemble everyone, but even he didn't know exactly why. All he had been told was that the new owner would be arriving today, and this meeting was mandatory. As the staff settled in, the doors to the dining room opened, and in walked Elijah, still dressed in the same uniform he'd worn that morning. For a moment, the room was silent, and the staff exchanged confused glances. Damien let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath. Elijah walked to the center of the room, his calm demeanor unchanged. He could feel the tension, the unspoken questions hanging in the air, but he didn't rush to explain. Instead, he let the silence linger for a few moments, meeting their gaze as one.